with you, and it's terrific to see so many familiar faces in the audience, recognising people who have shown in their lives a dedication to the quality of the natural environment in Australia and in other places, and have contributed to thinking about how all of that makes sense in a society focused on economic growth and progress and what all of that means. So, some reflections. For a long time, economists like me thought of the natural environment in much the same way that they thought about any other thing from which humans derive satisfaction or utility, like an ice cream or a night at the theatre. Nature was something to be appreciated, a source of intangible benefits labelled environmental amenity. An environmental amenity was merely something that humans could choose to trade off in pursuit of other rewards, both tangible and intangible. Sustainability meant nothing more than finding a balance of some sort as between competing arguments in a social welfare function of some sort. That's the framing that emerged from the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. It's what most people still have in mind when they talk about ecologically sustainable development, and it's nuts. Trading off environmental amenity for other rewards degrades the state of nature. That is, it degrades or has a negative impact on the extent and condition of the various biophysical assets that comprise the natural environment, and it impacts the ecological integrity of their composition. Eventually, the degradation of nature destroys everything else. In pursuit of material gains, we've already destroyed more than 1/2 of the forested area of Australia that existed pre-European settlement. We've rendered extinct about 100 species of fauna and flora and thousands of unique invertebrate species. As you know, more than 1,700 species and ecological communities are threatened today with extinction. And we know that they will become extinct without quite aggressive intervention. Much of our degradation of nature contributes, and we see this with increasing regularity, contributes to recursive environmental dynamics characterised by vicious cycles involving pollution of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere and the biosphere. We have created deserts. We have rendered waterways so toxic that they're incapable of supporting marine life fit for human consumption, or even in places supporting any marine life at all. Crops have been failing with increasing frequency and severity. Millions of hectares of land on this continent have been rendered unfit for agricultural activity, or condemned to very low levels of productivity due to the leaching of nutrients, acidification, soil erosion, and chemical toxicity. Many of these places now covered in herbicide-resistant exotic weeds and feral pests. And now, instead of affording protection from wild weather events, the natural environment has become their accelerator. We've turned nature against us. Our destruction of the natural environment poses an existential threat not only to environmental amenity, but to everything else we value. And so there are two big reasons for taking an interest in the condition of the natural world. The first is that our pursuit of material human progress has, to date, been at the expense of environmental amenity, and environmental amenity also matters to us. The second is that nature provides a flow of ecosystem services critical to the production of just about everything else we value. The activities responsible for the loss of environmental amenity and the deterioration in the quality of ecosystem services are ongoing. On Australia's eastern seaboard, where we are today, several 100,000 hectares of native vegetation are still being cleared every year. In New South Wales and Tasmania, governments are still using taxpayers' money to prop up the logging of native forests, principally to subsidise the export of low-value wood chips and pulp, but also to subsidise the supply of domestic firewood. In our remnant forests, habitat for endangered species, including the koala and the greater glider, is still being destroyed. Native species key to the integrity of natural ecosystems are still all over Australia being culled as pests and shot for sport. Wetlands are still being drained and filled, mangroves are still being ripped out, paddocks are still being ploughed, and they're being sprayed with chemical fertilisers that we know kill every living organism. We act as if we don't know how to stop ourselves. But we must know that we're getting close to a tipping point, a point beyond which total system collapse is inescapable. Well, that's a lot of bad news, but here's the good news. The good news is that some of us, and some of the us I'm talking about are in this room, have figured out how to measure what we've been doing and even how to estimate the costs of repair. The Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists estimates that we would need to spend about $7 billion a year over the next 30 years to repair most of the loss of ecological function in the Australian landscape that has occurred over the past 200 years. There's an emerging consensus, including amongst economists, that there's no human development pathway now available that does not involve a substantial investment in the restoration of nature. Investments in physical, financial, human and social capital, they cannot compensate, for the simple reason that unless we repair natural capital, those investments in physical, financial, human and social capital are unsafe. They'll make contributions to human development that will prove ephemeral, insubstantial and ultimately inconsequential. But how on earth do we turn this around? Well, it's trite to say that we need to provide landholders with an economic incentive to restore rather than degrade nature. And we do, of course, but how best to do that? Over recent years, a lot of effort's gone into designing instruments that might attract private funding to the repair of nature. I'm keen to see these pursued. In Australia right now, leveraging off climate policy provides the most promising avenue. The recent federal election outcome affirms broad community support for Australia's climate abatement obligations under the Paris Agreement, including, obviously, to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Now, many in the Australian community consider that we should commit to even more ambitious emissions abatement. Some say that instead of targeting net zero, we should be targeting so-called real zero. Many also point to the absurdity of Australia's responsibilities under the Paris Agreement not extending to the emissions generated by the burning of fossil fuels that have been extracted from the Australian continent and then exported. And this, by the way, is not a second-order issue, since the emissions we export are approximately 3 times the domestic emissions for which we have accepted responsibility under the Paris Agreement. But whatever your view on these things, achieving net zero by 2050, even as defined in the Paris Agreement, well, that's going to prove challenging. And it will have very significant implications for the condition of Australia's natural environment. These implications could be very good. These implications could also be very bad. According to the Climate Change Authority's recently released Sector Pathways Review, the Australian landscape is going to have to sequester about 120 million tonnes of carbon a year by the time we get to 2050, compared with an estimate of about 50 million tonnes in 2025. That's a big uptake. How's that going to be achieved? Well, the logic of Australia's current climate policy framework, if you put all the various bits together, is that every tonne of that increase in land-based carbon sequestration will be supported by an Australian carbon credit unit, an ACCU. These ACCUs will be purchased as offsets against residual emissions, that is, emissions remaining once we've exhausted every effort to reduce emissions from electricity and other sources of energy, from transport, from agriculture, from mining, oil and gas extraction, industrial processes, waste, and of course the built environment. Current emissions projections imply the need for a 10 to 15-fold increase in the annual volume of land-based sector ACCUs in the years to 2050. We are not talking business as usual. For those who will be required to purchase these ACCUs as offsets, price matters, obviously. It's understandable that many people in business emphasise the economic importance of least cost abatement. For several decades as a policy advisor to successive Australian governments, that was also my mantra. The instruments for achieving a least cost abatement are well known. There are not many of them. An economy-wide single rate carbon tax or an economy-wide cap and trade scheme. Well, we've tried both. Some of the people in this room have been involved in those efforts to implement least cost abatement approaches. And thus far, the Australian political system has failed to deliver. What we have instead is a political settlement, and it's described by a carbon policy toolkit that is certainly not a blueprint for least cost abatement. Importantly, this toolkit is all we have. And whilst it may be Plan B or may be better described as Plan C, it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. I'm sure many of the people in this room are smart enough to see how the various bits of that toolkit might be merged one day into an economy-wide cap and trade system. But we've run out of time. We have to make this work, and we have to make it work now. In today's climate policy framework, the marginal cost of carbon abatement, that is what we should think of as the carbon price, it's no higher than the cost of an ACCU, obviously. Minister Bowen has spoken of a cost containment measure to ensure that the price of ACCUs doesn't exceed $75, growing at CPI plus 2% from 2030, I think. Even with that cap, we should anticipate billions of dollars annually going into things that impact the Australian land sector for 25 years. And remember, this is just to implement the nation's climate policy. Billions of dollars a year going into investments in the Australian landscape to achieve the nation's climate policy. Now, I reckon if you were the nation's Treasurer or Environment Minister or Agriculture Minister, you would want to know where this money is going to be spent. And you would want to understand its likely impact on the productivity, resilience, and environmental integrity of the Australian landscape. And you'd want to know that because every one of those things has political salience. All of you are aware of continuing controversy surrounding the magnitude of carbon abatement being achieved by current land-based ACCU methods. All of you agree that the Australian community must have confidence that ACCUs are of high integrity and that the state of nature is receiving best value from their generation. In a future of a 10 to 15-fold increase in the supply of land-based ACCUs, the need for integrity and broad community support will be even more critical. We know from experience to date that ACCUs that also repair nature, like biodiverse plantings, have a higher probability of securing real carbon abatement. And it would be safe to assume that ACCUs that destroy nature will lack social licence, as they should. Moreover, the Australian government's commitment to the Global Biodiversity Framework goals to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030 will not be realised unless carbon and nature repair efforts are integrated, and I do mean integrated. So, there's considerable interest in ACCUs that also deliver a positive impact for the state of nature. And that's why we're here today. So I want to thank you for your interest. this is going to be some journey. Thank you.